Kings have the extra attacker. Extra attacker out in the net empty. Drop back and score! With the extra attacker!
The Extra Attackers Podcast with Maude and Jordan.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Extra Attackers Podcast. Maude and Jordan here once again, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about our favorite team, the Ottawa Senators, and a rumor that was started by the one and only Elliotte Friedman. You want to introduce it, Jordan?
Sure. So basically, Friedman hypothesized on his 32 Thoughts podcast with Jeff Merrick that because of the Alfredsson connection, Alfredsson and Erik Karlsson are friends. Karlsson currently plays for Pittsburgh. If you didn't know, he used to be a superstar here in Ottawa before we traded him away, I think in 2019. There are some rumors, or I should say speculation from Friedman about a potential coming back together of those two guys because they're very good friends. Potentially, Pittsburgh looks like they're going into a rebuild, and Ottawa, even though it doesn't seem like it this season, is kind of supposed to be on the upswing. So potentially there could be a reunion of sorts there, but this is just speculation at this point.
And it got to the point that media members in Pittsburgh actually asked him about it here today. So just as we introduce the topic, I'm going to play the little clip of Erik Karlsson responding to the Ottawa rumors. This is from Nick Horwat on Twitter. Hopefully I pronounced that right. A Pittsburgh Penguins reporter. So this is what Karlsson had to say when asked about the rumors.
On your way back to Ottawa.
Yeah, that's Canada for you. Played there for a long time, so I kind of know how that game works. They got a lot of things to talk about every day because they got a lot of airtime, but very few things to actually discuss. So they like to make up these what if scenarios, and that's just the way it is, and it's not something that I really look into.
So we are going to be the Canadian media making up those what-if scenarios that he was talking about there. He himself is obviously not going to comment on this at the moment, as he's just recently a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins. It hasn't even been his first full season yet. So obviously, I'm sure personally he is not doesn't have like moving again on the mind. But, it is possible with that Alfredsson-Karlsson connection that he could be coming back, eh?
It could happen. I do think that this is more speculation than something that's of high likelihood at this point in time, mostly because of the contract that Erik Karlsson has. I think he's retained to, is it like 8 mil, roughly, maybe a little higher than that?
He's actually still on 10 mil, so it was retained. Okay. It was retained from 11.5 million to 10 mil.
Yeah, I mean that's even higher than I thought. So that complicates things. You'd probably need more retainment. If you're going to require him, if you're Ottawa. There's also the big question of whether or not he's what Ottawa needs. He's an offensive-minded right-handed D with defensive deficiencies. Obviously, his offense more than makes up for any sort of defensive issues he has, and he's not as bad defensively as a lot of people cracked him up to be over his time in Ottawa. But it's still something that I don't know if Ottawa really needs. I think they're more looking for a big body, a tough right-handed defenseman that can defend well, and that's his mantra essentially. However, I will say maybe you could reconfigure the defense a little bit to fit him in if this is something you actually want to look into. It's going to be interesting if this gains more traction during the offseason.
Yeah, so the fact that the Sens' pretty much biggest need right now is a really good right-handed defenseman, and those are really hard to get, especially a really good shutdown guy. The one possible thing that could be a good idea here in terms of reworking the D-core is that you have all these offensive-minded left defensemen and you need good shutdown right defensemen. If you were able to get a really good offensive defenseman on the right-hand side, it might be easier to find a good defensive D for the left-hand side, although it would require making multiple moves most likely. But that's the one thing that makes me a little curious about it. It might be easier to do that than to just get another stud right-hand D who's really good defensively, because those guys don't get moved very often.
That's kind of what I was thinking too. There are some good options in free agency for right-handed D this year. Like Matt Roy would be someone I would hope the Senators would look at. And there's a couple other lesser names. But it's, like you said, just objectively easier to find left-handed defensemen that fit that mold. I will say though that if that's something that you're looking into, you would probably trade both Shabbat and Chikrin, eh? If that was what you wanted to do, because obviously you wouldn't want Karlsson playing on your third pairing. He'd want to be on your second pairing. Sanderson Zub is probably the first pairing, and unless you think Karlsson and Sanderson would work well together, which I think there could be potential there, but unless you think that's a perfect fit and you don't need to go elsewhere, if you do think that you need to go elsewhere, I like. Do you want Shabbat or Chikrin effectively playing on your third pair? Like it could be like you could of course allocate the ice time so that whoever the lefty is that you bring in gets generally less than those players. But is that the makeup that the team wants to have? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it really depends on if you would want to play Sanderson and Karlsson together. Because if you did do that, having either Shabbat or Chikrin on the second pair with Zub would be a pretty good setup. But the thing that I wonder about if you had Sanderson and Karlsson playing together is that even though Sanderson isn't quite the offensive dynamo that Karlsson is, he relies on his strong skating as like the number one aspect of his game. He is going up and down the ice all the time. He's constantly jumping up in the rush and making plays, starting plays, or jumping up to try to finish plays. You know, we saw that in the last game against Pittsburgh where he scored the first Senators goal in regulation there, just jumping up into the slot. He would have to change his game a little bit if he was playing with Karlsson. Obviously, we know Jake Sanderson is very good defensively, especially defending off the rush. But when you're playing with Erik Karlsson, you kind of have to be the guy who stays back while Karlsson does all that stuff. And that might not necessarily be playing to Jake Sanderson's strengths, although I do believe that he could do it. I don't know if that would be the best setup. So you raise a good point there, that if you probably wouldn't want to have those guys together, and then the question is, what do you do with Shabbat and Chikrin?
That's the biggest thing. Like you could trade both of them away and get like decent returns. I would think maybe not so much on Shabbat because of his contract, but potentially you could get something interesting. And then, I mean, that brings up the other question: would Pittsburgh want Shabbat or Chikrin as part of a return? Potentially, maybe that you kind of kill two birds with one stone. One of them is part of the return, and then the other one you can trade at the draft. Another point during the offseason if you don't want to do that. And I agree with you. I think like the Sanderson Karlsson dynamic would probably end up working, but it has the potential to take away from Sanderson's strengths, which, like you said, is smooth skating. And even though he is arguably the smartest defensive player on the team, he does jump into the rush quite a bit and push forward when defending at the offensive blue line quite a lot. And those are trademarks you would expect Karlsson to have as well. So would you see situations where they're constantly caught pinching? Like maybe one of them is able to alter their game a little bit to compensate for that, but it's a bit of an unknown. And I mean, we don't really know exactly what this management group wants to do. There are a lot of rumors and it's going to be an interesting offseason, but I still get kind of the sense that that's something they're not really looking into too intensely at this point. And it might be more of a speculation thing.
I think it's bringing back Karlsson probably isn't like the number one priority for Steve Staios this offseason, but it still could be an interesting thing worth looking into, especially if they have decided that they want to move one of Shabbat or Chikrin. Obviously, they didn't get any offers that they thought were good enough to deal Jacob Chikrin at the deadline, but it probably is something that they're still looking at, considering his contract status is up in the air past next season. But I still think it's fun to look at some potential scenarios if we were able to bring Karlsson back from the Pittsburgh Penguins on his current contract. And I decided to pull up some cap-friendly mock trades just to see what fans are thinking in terms of if a deal like this were to actually go down. And, you know, a couple of these are made by SENS fans, but some of them are actually made by Penguins fans, which I thought would be interesting to see what they would want in return for Karlsson. And, you know, we're talking a whole thing about if you bring in Karlsson, Chikrin and Shabbat, one or maybe both would probably have to go just to get, you know, different play styles in there on the blue line. And the thing is, a lot of these mock trades do include Chikrin or Karlsson going to the Penguins. The first one that I'm going to bring up here is, it was made by a Pittsburgh fan, and they straight up just said Jacob Chikrin for Erik Karlsson, with Karlsson 2.5 million retained. So then he would be, I believe, at 7.5 million at that number. Okay. And so just straight up for Jacob Chikrin, would you do that deal if you were the Sens?
Yeah, I honestly think that's kind of close. to fair value. I do think that Chychrun has a higher value because his contract is so low. He'll be he has another full season at that contract. If this happens in the offseason, it wouldn't be a pure rental move. I'm pretty sure Dubas would have a good idea of whether or not he could extend Chychrun. And even though Karlsson certainly isn't washed, he's not the 100-point player we saw last season, this season. So if I were Stayos and hearing that trade, maybe I would push for like, I don't know, a second or a third added to the Penguin side of things. And then maybe call it at that. I don't think it needs a ton of modifications, but I think overall Chychrun probably has higher value. So I think that's what I would say. But well, what about you, Maude?
The thing that's tough for me, if you're giving up either Chabot or Chychrun just straight up for Karlsson, is that you're giving up a guy who's 25, 26, depending on which guy it is, for a guy who's like 34 or 35, however old Karlsson is now, which is tough for me if you give them straight up, because like you said, I would think that Jacob Chychrun holds a little bit more trade value than Erik Karlsson at the moment. Obviously, he's not a better player, but just because of the contract and the age and the fact that you could extend Chychrun ideally for long term for less than what Karlsson would even be making with salary retention, I think that helps his value. The thing for me is that I would feel a little weird trading such a prime-aged player for such an old one just straight up. Like, maybe I could live with it if you traded Jacob Chychrun to another team for like a bunch of picks and prospects or whatever, and then you keep some of them, so that you still retain a little bit of value from him, right. And then you go make your offer for Karlsson, maybe including some of the picks that you got for Chychrun, or just other assets that the Sens have. I feel like I would be more comfortable with it that way, just to get a little bit more value out of the younger asset.
I would agree with that. Yeah, like that's the big disparity, right? Like he's about 8 or 9 years older than Chychrun, and like 7 or 8 years older than Chabot. I think Chabot's 27 now. So that's a big gap. And arguably Karlsson could help us for a couple of seasons. Like at 34, I would feel like maybe 2 or 3 seasons while he's still effective. Whereas the assets you could get for a Chychrun or Chabot, just trading them for prospects or picks, would effectively be on your roster for like a decade if you wanted them to be. And if they decided it was best. So that is a good point. I would probably, like obviously a 3-team trade is possible. That could be an interesting avenue to explore in this. But like you said, I think it would be a good idea to maybe explore what you could get for Chychrun by himself or Chabot, and then bundle what the leftovers of that or the assets that you need from that into a Karlsson trade. I think that's probably a little bit more savvy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to fact check myself on the age, Karlsson is turning 34 in May. So if we acquired him in the offseason, he would start at 34 and 3 more years left on the deal. He would be, I think, 37 by the time it ends. Still some good hockey left in him, but it's obviously not his prime compared to giving up guys in their prime like Chabot and Chychrun. Obviously, there's still question marks about both Chabot and Chychrun's games, specifically injuries for Thomas Chabot, which probably lowers his value a little bit, and he does have a high cap hit as well as Erik Karlsson, so he gets thrown into some of these trade proposals too. Another one that I'm going to bring up here, this was again presumably made by a Pittsburgh fan because they were doing a Pittsburgh mock lineup in here. They did Thomas Chabot, Josh Norris, and a 4th-round pick, which is whatever, in return for Karlsson, $1.5 million retained, Marcus Pettersson, and Riley Smith. What do you think of that?
That's an interesting one. Lots of moving pieces in that trade. It's funny because I don't expect it to happen, but if the Sens got the first overall pick and were able to draft Celebrini, this is something I would potentially explore, because Josh Norris becomes much more redundant at that point in time. And even though he has terrible injury problems, we have seen players like Phil Kessel, Vladimir Tarasenko, who've had extensive work done on their shoulders over time, and then eventually they come back and it just seems like they're over it. And like even Tarasenko especially, and frankly, Kessel had his whole career after that happened. They returned to prime form after those happened. So I'm not saying that Josh Norris is dead yet. However, if the Sens don't get that pick of Celebrini, I don't know, like it's putting a lot of pressure on players like Pinto and Grieg to jump up the lineup. Pinto would immediately become your second line center. And even though I think he's probably good enough to occupy that, I would want to see another season out of him before I determine if that's more of a streak based thing, because he's starting off really well. But to know if this is what he is or if it's more of a streak. Same with Grieg, seeing how he develops a little bit more. I'd be a little bit against trading Norris at this point for those reasons. But at the same time, I wouldn't blame the Sens for like looking into that sort of thing just because of his injury history.
Yeah, and I think he would be an enticing asset for Kyle Dubas, just because if he does bounce back, you could have Crosby feeding him some one-timers on the power play, and that could be pretty sick. And like you said, I think it would be enticing to move on from him if we were able to get one of those top forwards in the draft, either Celebrini or maybe Demidov. But again, do you want to rush a guy like Demidov to the NHL right away if he's even ready? Or Celebrini, is he that type of... is he like a McDavid type where he can just be great right away, or is he more of like a Jack Hughes type where it takes him a couple years to really break out and be a point per game player? So it could be kind of risky to move Norris, even though the risk exists for him with his injuries. It could be risky to give up on him too. Like you said, we've seen other players be able to bounce back from these shoulder surgeries in the past. But I think I would probably be willing to give him up in a Karlsson deal just because the injury risk is there. Even though I do love Josh Norris, love having him on the team when he's healthy. The thing that I do kind of like about this offer from the Penguins' perspective, or from what they're giving to the Sens from the Penguins, is that Steve Staios obviously wants to bring in a lot of veterans, good quality veterans who have won before. Riley Smith fits the bill for that. I think I forgot to mention it, but they also retained salary on Riley Smith in this deal too, so you'd be getting him for relatively cheap. And Marcus Pettersson is a pretty good veteran too. So I think Staios would be looking to bring in guys like that. But the only thing that I wonder about is you're bringing in Karlsson from Pittsburgh. If you bring in a bunch of other veterans from Pittsburgh with him, like we've seen this veteran formula already hasn't worked in Pittsburgh this year. Like maybe we would just be acquiring a bunch of their veterans who are like close to being over the hill, right? Like I know Riley Smith isn't exactly having a great season in Pittsburgh, and I don't know about Marcus Pettersson, but I think he's been kind of up and down for his career in Pittsburgh. So I think that's something. Those are the type of players that Steve Staios might be interested in, but do you give up your young guys like Josh Norris in a deal for a bunch of veterans? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I also think like come free agency, there's going to be a lot of Riley Smith and Marcus Pettersson's around. I don't think it's going to be hard to fill those roles. So it really comes down to like, would you rather get them from Pittsburgh at the expense of Norris or keep a player like Norris and kind of see what happens? It's different with Chabot because if this happened, undoubtedly one of Chabot or Chikrin would have to be gone anyway. But with Norris, there's still some potential there. He's young. I think he's only 24 or turning 24. So if he bounces back, there's a lot of potential there as well. And yeah, I don't know if it's the right time to swing at a bunch of veterans. Ottawa hasn't necessarily been doing that, but they've been going big game hunting the past couple of seasons. And I wonder if this is kind of time to pump the brakes on that, try to augment the roster more through free agency and just see what happens there so that you don't invest a bunch of draft capital that essentially gets wasted because the team just doesn't live up to expectations, which has been the case. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting proposal, and that trade would be seismic, but I don't know if I would do it personally.
Mm-hmm. One of the other trade offers that I did see, and this one I believe was made by a Sens fan, where it was another veteran player included alongside Karlsson that I did like a little bit better, was that they included Brian Rust. And I think I did see one by a Penguins fan, a different one, where they also included Brian Rust. And I think that would be a great acquisition for the Sens. He might not produce as much if he's not playing with Sidney Crosby, but I don't know, put him with Tim Stützle and it would probably still be pretty good. That's the type of player that I would prefer to be added in with Karlsson if we were able to do anything like that. And he's got a few years left on his deal too, so that's something I would like to see. Another thing that I would like to see from Pittsburgh, if we could get anything else out of them, is Pierre-Olivier Joseph, just to reunite the brothers, and especially since I don't know if Eric Brandstrom is going to be back next season. I'm not sure what the new management thinks of him. He could be a replacement there, and then you get the brotherhood as well, eh?
That would be fun. That'd be a fun storyline. I would be for that. And he's pretty good as well. I think he's having a down season this year, but he's still young, so lots of potential there.
And yeah, so most of these mock trades, it's always Shabbat or Norris or both or Jacob Chikrin, basically. Sometimes someone will try to get the Penguins to take on Eunice Corpusalo and like take back Tristan Jarry, which would never happen. Like
Yeah, no,
that's just
doubt that.
goofy as hell. But I don't know. Like, I would like to see Karlsson back in Ottawa, but I don't know if it makes sense from an asset management perspective. I think maybe if you could sell off Thomas Chabot and Chikrin in their own deals, two separate trades, get a handful of assets, and then make a move for Karlsson, and then, sign like a defensive-minded left-handed D to play with him, and then you have like a new guy and Karlsson, and then Sanderson and Zub as your top four. I think that could be really cool, and maybe since you're moving Chabot and Chikrin in separate deals as opposed to straight up for Karlsson, maybe you retain some assets too, so you didn't just entirely give up all of their trade value just for Karlsson. I think I could be interested in that, but it's tricky to make this work from an asset management perspective, just because of the cap. Like, because Chabot makes so much money and Chikrin will need a new contract as well, it's like those are the obvious guys to move out on defense, but again, you're giving up 25, 26-year-old defenseman for a 34-year-old one. Even though he's really good, it's tough. It's tough to convince me, I feel like, even though I would love to see Karlsson back with the Sens.
Yeah, like it's great for the storyline, but I don't know if it would be any better than just adding a defender in free agency for a lot less risk inherently. Like, obviously, this depends on what Kyle Dubas actually wants. If it's a situation where Karlsson, because I think he has a no movement clause, but if it's a situation where he's like, I'm only going to Ottawa, and that like nullifies some of the return a little bit, and it's not as big as we expect.
That would be great.
That would be great. I'd be more on board. I would be on board with that, but no guarantee of that happening. So maybe it's something that gets explored, but it's fun to talk about. But it's a hard puzzle piece to fit together, admittedly.
And if Karlsson said, "Oh, I would only waive to go to Ottawa as well," like Dubas might just say, "Well, if we're not really going to get anything for you, maybe you'll just stick around because you have 3 years term, right?" Like,
Kind of true, yeah.
He might not be in a rush to deal him at that point then, and then maybe just wait until a future year, maybe when he's going to be a UFA and, trade him to a contender at the deadline for a playoff run or something like that. It's not
That's
like
right.
Dubas has to be trading Erik Karlsson right now, unless he requests a trade, which after just one season in Pittsburgh, I don't think he's like really in a rush to get out of there, even though he has in the past kind of been in a rush to get out of his previous teams when they aren't contenders. But Pittsburgh, even though they're bad this year, they haven't been so bad that it's like unbearable. So I could see Karlsson being willing to stick around for another season and see if they can turn it around next year, even though they are kind of angling to a rebuild, retool sort of thing. You still have Crosby, you still have Malkin, so there's still a chance that they could have a bounce back year next year.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I feel kind of bad for Karlsson. Ultimately,
Yeah.
like, dude gets traded from Ottawa to San Jose. San Jose has one good playoff run with him, just completely fall off a cliff the next season. I mean, that's how we got Stutzla. Gets traded to Pittsburgh a couple of years later after an amazing 100-point season. Pittsburgh does poorly. Like, they're not as bad as San Jose, but they're like 10 points away from making the playoffs. So likely not happening. This guy deserves more playoff hockey. After what we saw in 2017, I wish he got more of a chance. It's kind of disappointing for him.
Speaking of the first round picks in the Karlsson trade, or both Karlsson trades, I mean, the Pittsburgh Penguins first round pick is currently, let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8th overall. If that ends up being a top 10 pick again in an Erik Karlsson trade, that would be crazy, especially if it won the lottery and moved up. That would be really funny. You know what? Like, other than the Sens or also my Blue Jackets winning the lottery, I would kind of love to see that Penguins pick win the lottery. Although I think, did it have a condition? Would it shift to the next year?
I forget. I feel like there was a condition.
It probably was. Let's see. I have the Karlsson trade open. Let's see if
I don't
it had
remember
a
the exact
condition.
condition.
Where is it? Okay, yeah, it is top 10 protected. Okay. Never mind then. So even if it stays at 8th overall, they can shift it till next year. But then the problem is, for the Penguins, if they're going full rebuild, they might just want to give up that 8th overall pick if that's the slot that it stays at. That's interesting too.
That's true. That's going to determine what happens next season. And I mean, it seems like guys like Crosby, Well, Malkin and Letang are more so done, but Crosby still got a lot in him. So it's going to be interesting to see, because if you trade away Crosby, which I don't necessarily expect, but if that were to happen in this offseason, I don't know what you do if you're Kyle Dubas. Do you hold on to the pick, or you're like, well, without Crosby, we're going to be so much worse next year?
Yeah, it's either give up that 8th pick and just tank for next year, or take that 8th pick, give up the one for next year, and then try to improve and try to be better. It's a really tough decision. It's a little bit similar to when Pierre Dorion had traded away the first for Duchesne, and he had to choose the Brady Tkachuk pick or the future pick.
Right.
He made the right choice there. One of the few rare things that Pierre Dorion did correctly. But what I was going to say earlier was I wish the pick wasn't conditional, because it would be kind of funny to see after the San Jose pick being Tim Stützle from the Erik Karlsson trade. It would be funny to see some karma for San Jose where they could get a lottery pick moving up in return for trading Karlsson away. That would be just a little bit of a karmic justice for them. But
would be
can't
funny.
happen exactly unless Pittsburgh chooses to use the pick this year and punt it to next year, and then they suck again. So it could happen. It could happen.
It could happen. And I think technically, if we're being very technical about this, I'm pretty sure that the draft pick that we got for Karlsson had a chance to be the previous year's first round pick, but it got pushed back a year because the condition on the other first round pick they traded wasn't met because they met the playoffs. So theoretically, it could have under certain circumstances. So
I have the Erik Karlsson trade history open on Cap Friendly to see both of the trades, and like there was 4 picks in the deal, and they all had conditions on them. So there's like 8 notes in the list of like, this condition happened, this one didn't. Like, and I'm like, oh my god, I want to find the answer here, but like there's so much information on the screen that I'm like, should I sit here reading all of it to figure it out? But I think you're right. Like one of them was the Sens would receive a first round pick from the Sharks if Karlsson is on an Eastern Conference roster during the 2018. Oh, you remember when they flipped Mike Hoffman to Florida?
Oh, right. That's why that's there.
Dorian was scared of them doing it again. That's so funny.
That's hilarious. Dude,
I mean, if they did do it, we would have just gotten another pick from them, which would have been sick, because then they probably would have sucked. They probably still would have sucked.
That's true.
If that happened, but that's hilarious that's in there.
Forgot about that.
And then, oh my god, there's like 3 other conditions on the first round pick. So I don't know. There were so many conditions. It makes it so complicated. NHL GMs are very creative these days with their pick conditions.
That's certainly true. We're seeing a lot of different ones this season, including we mentioned before, but one this season that involved a player on a completely different team.
Yeah, I had never seen that before.
No, so it's kind of funny when you see stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. And just before we wrap up, I think I want to talk about the Eastern Conference playoff race. You know, we were just talking about how Pittsburgh has fallen out of it. It's kind of getting a little more interesting than I thought it was going to be. For a while there, it seemed like the Detroit Red Wings and Tampa Bay Lightning had the wildcard spots on lockdown, but the Red Wings, with 6 losses in a row, all in regulation, have made things interesting entirely. Like their own fault too. It's not that these other teams chasing them have been great lately, although the New York Islanders have been pretty good in their last 10 games, but Detroit seems to be choking it. So I thought it would be interesting to take a little look at the standings right now. We're recording this on Thursday before any of the games are played, so Detroit is going to play the Arizona Coyotes tonight. You would think that's a favorable matchup, but they played them last week and got shut out 4-0. So,
oh my god!
So this is the rematch from that, and they could just lose it again. And Islanders, Washington, I think Buffalo too. They all play tonight, so we could see the standings shuffle around a little bit more after these games are played. But I wanted to take a look at it and sort of predict who you think is actually going to get that last wildcard spot. It is possible that the Tampa Bay Lightning could fall out too, but they do have a bit more of a cushion. I'd like to think they'll be able to get it done and stay in. So I think it's really that last wildcard spot that's up for grabs. What do you think of Detroit's recent slump, really? And do you think that they're going to reclaim that wildcard spot?
Well, I'm not shedding too many tears over it. I'll say that.
Me neither.
It's interesting though, because I'm pretty sure the Islanders are in that spot, right?
Yes.
Jumped, yeah. honestly, like this seems kind of like a momentum sort of thing. Like Patrick Waugh has been doing good work for the Islanders. They've certainly been improving, and that's kind of swung them into some good fortune into the playoff spot, while Detroit has been careening off the road and into a tree the last little while. Generally, I do think that Detroit will get back to like what they were playing at before, but it might not be as they might not be as good. It might be like just slightly above a 500 clip or something like that. I don't think this is indicative of what the team actually is. I think they'll return to form, I guess is the best way to say it. But at the same time, it seems like the Islanders are only on the way up. So it's going to be an interesting battle. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Islanders played well enough down the stretch to capitalize on this, because there's roughly about 20 games left for every team. And that's not a lot of time when you're looking at the full season. And if Detroit is having these issues now, that like even though it is 20 games, it's still not a ton of time to reclaim that spot if the Islanders continue to play well. So I mean, of course, it determined like it's based on what happens tonight with the Coyotes and what happens in the next couple of days. But if they continue to lose, it's gonna be really hard for them to make a pushback for that spot.
Should mention as well that the Islanders currently have 1 game in hand over both Detroit and Tampa, and they have 2 games in hand over the Flyers, who they are 4 points behind. So it is possible as well that the Islanders could move up to 3rd in their division, and then you would have Philly battling out for the wildcard spots too. So Philly isn't totally out of the woods yet either in that 3rd division spot. But yeah, like, it's tough for me to evaluate the Red Wings because the whole course of the season leads me to believe that, oh yeah, they're better than they're currently playing and they should bounce back a little bit, still have a chance to get in. But also, I didn't think that they were going to be this good at the beginning of the season, and I was kind of waiting for the fall off, and it just never happened until now. So the biased side in me is like, I knew this was going to happen, like, so I'm kind of torn both ways, because I don't think that they're just going to like completely bottom out. They should stay in the race and get some wins soon. I don't think they're going to lose like 10 in a row. I think they'll probably win tonight, win a couple of the next games. But they also, after the Arizona game, they play Buffalo, which is an interesting matchup too, because Buffalo plays Detroit, or they play the Islanders tonight, and then they play Detroit. If Buffalo wins both of those games, they're going to be suddenly be close too. They're going to be like 1 point behind if neither the Red Wings or Islanders pick up any points in the next 2 games. So I wouldn't count them out either. And then you do have Washington in the mix too, but they don't inspire much confidence in me. I don't think they're even really trying to make the playoffs. They're just kind of in the middle.
Right.
But yeah, like, I would say it's pretty clearly between Islanders and Red Wings, even though those other 2 teams do have a little bit of an outside chance. But in my mind, the Islanders roster on paper is clearly better than the Red Wings. The Islanders were underperforming all season, whereas the Red Wings have been overperforming all season. Like, if you compare just the defense and goaltending between the Islanders and Red Wings, like, it's a landslide for the Islanders. Yeah. And if you compare the forwards, like, Barzal is better than anyone on the Red Wings. Larkin is close, right? The 2 of them as the 1Cs, they're pretty close. Larkin is having the best season of his career, but he's also injured right now. The entire 6-game losing streak has been without Larkin in the lineup for the Red Wings, which is tough, and he's not returning yet. So hopefully they can figure something out without him. But like, Detroit has this forward depth, but I think the Islanders have forward depth too. It's like, to me, it feels like the Islanders are finally playing up to what they should be, and Detroit is just falling back to what they should be, which is like closer to like the middle of the conference, just like outside the wild card,
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with that. This might be kind of more indicative of where they should be. And I mean, we're expecting every team like Buffalo, Ottawa, Detroit to kind of be in this murky middle. Obviously, that's gone differently for a couple of teams. But it is still very close, which is interesting. And I mean, I'm sure when they get Larkin back, that's going to infuse a lot of momentum into that team. Maybe they'll perform well over the next little stretch. But Larkin has been injured a couple times this season. And like throughout his career, I seem to remember him being injured semi-regularly. So, I mean, if this continues to happen, I wonder how much it's going to affect the Red Wings. Like, is the injury proneness, if he comes back and gets injured again, is that going to just kill their run later in the season? There's a lot of hard things to determine with Detroit, whereas with the Islanders, like, I agree that their roster is better, and I think with better coaching, they've done a lot better. So it seems like there's more pointing to the Islanders being the team that they are than Detroit being the team that was essentially playing over their heads for most of the season. Not to say that Detroit is bad, but it's more of a murky middle.
Yeah, and since you mentioned as well that Larkin has been injured once or twice already this year, they did fine when he was injured previously. They didn't lose all the games when he was out before. I remember when he had the injury that happened in the game against the Sens. I was like, ooh, they're going to be in tough without him for a while. He came back sooner than expected, but also like they just won the next couple of games after that anyway. So I don't know if you can pin it entirely on missing Larkin. Obviously, it hurts, but I do think it is a little bit of the team coming back down to earth. And we do also have to point out as a Senators podcast that Alex DeBrincat is a fraud. He is not he is not a 40 goal scorer. At the beginning of the year, it looked like he was going to score 50. I don't know if that's ever going to happen in his career at this point. But
yeah, dude, he's streaky as hell.
So streaky. Like, I actually can't believe it. Like, I'm being a hater right now, but like at the beginning of the season, it was like, oh, he's got his mojo back. He's going to be back to that 40 goal form. And then when they brought in, he kind of started slumping before they brought in Kane again. But then you're like, oh, you get the connection back with Kane, and it hasn't really materialized. Like, they've had some good moments together, but I think he's below point per game at this point, which is he doesn't necessarily have to be a point per game player if he scores 40 goals, but he's not close to that either. Like, he doesn't even have 30 yet, I don't think.
Yeah, like his streak sometimes where he's gone like 15 games with 1 or 2 goals, it's insane. Especially with what was happening at the beginning of the year. Like it's pretty crazy. And I like don't watch them enough to know if he's just been disappointing or if it's been more of a luck based thing. But I'm not crying any tears over it. I don't have anything necessarily against DeBrincat. I think he should go and be with his family. But the comments about him, like essentially insinuating that he was barely trying with Ottawa, did rub me the wrong way. So
yeah,
when this sort of thing happens, I'm not exactly upset.
Mm-hmm. I do think the silver lining here, though, for Detroit is that even though it's like, oh, young team on the rise, they're close to a playoff spot when they weren't expected to be. The silver lining is that their roster currently is actually not very young outside of like Seider and Raymond. It's filled with a lot of veterans. So the fact that they're already close to the playoffs with what they have currently, and most of their top prospects are not even on the team yet, like Simon Edvinsson, and I think they also have Wallinder, a defenseman, and Nate Danielson, the center, and Mario Kasper, I believe. Like, I think, could be wrong. Hopefully I don't get roasted by Detroit fans if I'm forgetting any top prospects, but I think those are their big guys. None of them are on the team yet. A good chunk of those guys were top 10 picks who are developing well in the minors. So, like, you're close to the playoffs and those guys are not even on your team yet, I think is a really good sign. It's possible that if you can just ease those guys in while still having those veterans, that the team could really take off next year. And if they can build on what they did this season, even if they don't make the playoffs, like, it looks like a good future for them.
Yeah, I agree with that. Obviously, it would be impressive if they made the playoffs this season, but they don't exactly need to. They have a lot of good building blocks, and those prospects coming in will just reinvigorate the team at the right time. So they're set up quite nicely. I think Yzerman has done a pretty good job overall. So there's lots to be excited about for the future if you're a Detroit fan as well.
I have to say as well, I am gonna predict that they're going to beat the Coyotes today, because I dropped Alex Lyon in one of my fantasy leagues. So we know what that means. We know that means that he's about to have a shutout.
Guaranteed
tonight,
shutout.
Right?
Yeah.
So hey, but I stuck with him for a while, but someone had dropped Stuart Skinner after a bad game, and then he's just kind of sitting there, and I was like, why has no one picked him up? So I had to, after Lyon was getting just torched for the past 2 weeks, I had to make that switch, you know?
No, it's a good idea. Although you've just killed Skinner's career again, unfortunately.
Dude, but the thing is, on my other team, I've still had him for the season, right? Okay, even though I dropped him twice at the beginning of the year and brought him back because no one else would touch him at the beginning of the year. But then they had that 16-game win streak, and it's all Gucci for Skinner now. But I dropped Lyon, which means that he's about to start playing well again. So. They'll turn it around. Don't worry, Wings fans. I've given you the good mojo of releasing Lyon from my fantasy team. I also had dropped Raymond, and as soon as I dropped him, he had 2 points in the last game. So
the Detroit fan base thanks you, Maude, for your sacrifice.
Exactly. So don't worry, Detroit. Everything will be okay. You know.
Yeah, it'll turn out fine.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think if I had to predict, I would say that the Islanders are going to get in. I do wonder about the Flyers potentially falling off at the end of the season here because they're in the same position as the Red Wings, really, where they weren't expected to be in the playoffs. I think they do have a bit more of a younger roster at the moment than Detroit does with more rookies. But I think the Islanders will get in. Maybe the Flyers slip out in favor of the Red Wings, but I wouldn't say that the Red Wings... I wouldn't give them a great chance right now, but it's still been an awesome season for them regardless. Even if they fall off at the end of the cliff here, they really entertained their fans and gave them good hockey for 80% of the season, which is something that the Sens never do. So I'm jealous. I'm still jealous even if they don't make the playoffs.
I mean, what? Like, the race there, I mean, I think the Sens are only, 18 points out?
Yeah. We are not
doable.
Mathematically eliminated yet.
Exactly. There's still a chance.
You know what makes me angry? The Islanders in the playoff spot at the moment. Guess how many more wins they have than the Sens?
Well, it's not a lot because they had a bunch of overtime
with the loser points.
losses.
Yeah. Take a guess.
Ooh, I'm gonna say 5.
It's 3.
Really?
It's 3.
I thought I was undershooting it with that.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
14 overtime losses goes a long way. Like, again, they have 4 less wins than Detroit and 5 less wins than Tampa. It's really goofy. We got to get the 3-2-1 point system from the PWHL into here because even though I do think the Islanders are a good team on paper and they were underperforming, if you lose that many games in overtime, you shouldn't be boosted up in the standings because of it.
I agree. Yeah, no, I think what they have in the PWHL is good. I honestly think they should have copied it for the last couple of years now, honestly. But I mean, what can you do? We'll see if that changes in the future.
Yeah, and we've even seen, it's tough to compare because it's only a 6-team league, but we have seen PWHL Ottawa get a lot of overtime losses, which has really hurt them in the standings. If it had the NHL point system, they would probably be boosted up a decent amount, you know?
Yeah.
And other teams would have less points as well as a result. So if the PWHL had the NHL system, PWHL Ottawa would be looking better. And if it was the reverse in the NHL, the Islanders would be looking worse. So I think that's something that they could potentially look at. You also have the Bruins battling for first in the Atlantic while having 15 overtime losses. They have more than the Islanders, which is pretty funny.
That is funny.
I think if, they're 3 points behind the Panthers right now, but the Panthers have 8 or 7 more wins. Like, if the Bruins get first in the division while having less than or more than 5 wins less than the Panthers, that's gonna piss me off too.
It's gonna look a little goofy, admittedly, right? If that scenario happened, I do wonder if that would force the NHL to look into it a little bit more.
Yeah, if they get the Islanders claiming the last playoff spot with less wins than the 5 teams behind them like they currently have, and then you get the Bruins winning the division with way less wins than the Panthers, it's going to be looking pretty goofy. And I think maybe at the GM meetings a few GMs of teams affected might be complaining.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we're going to see because they're going to talk about a certain set of rules in the offseason, or there's an expected certain set of rules that they'll talk about. I'm sure they'll go over offside again in situations where you score 20 seconds after being an inch offside. I don't know if there'll be any resolution, but with the PWHL being new this season, I do wonder if this is an opportunity for them to look at that league and be like, hey, these rules have worked pretty effectively. Maybe we'll bring them over. Of course, there are some rules that I don't think are transferable to the NHL, but things like the point system, I think definitely are. So I do wonder if that's something they look at a little bit more, just because that league has been doing so well over the last couple months.
Mm-hmm. They're doing a thing where the first seed gets to pick their opponent for the first round of the playoffs. Out of probably out of 2 choices or something.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's out of everyone. Maybe they can. It would be really funny if a first seed team was really ballsy and just picked the second seed team in the first round, just saying nah, we're gonna steamroll them, even though they're second place. That would be crazy to see in the NHL. That's probably not necessarily something that I would advocate for, especially because I think that the first seed would just always pick the 7th or 8th seed to play against. But I don't know. There's interesting ideas in the women's league, and the NHL could take notes for sure.
No, agreed. And then they also have the fun draft rule, where after it was after the trade deadline or something, the team that gets the most points that's out of the playoffs after that point in time will get the first pick, something like that. I think that's a fun rule. I don't think you could ever do that in the NHL, but I do think it's a fun rule.
I think when I saw that was announced, I made a tweet that said the Sens would win that every year if that was the rule. Because we know how it goes with them just going crazy in March and April and just winning out and making their record look close to 500, even though they were way below it before. So I don't know. It would benefit the Sens maybe, but I don't know.
I mean, at least between the PWHL and the NHL, both Ottawa teams are consistent in disappointing their fan bases. So
yeah, exactly.
It's appreciated. Thanks, guys, for keeping these consistent.
Hopefully we can get some better hockey in the nation's capital here soon. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you everyone so much for watching or listening. Have a good one.